civilization tends to build infrastructure when a shared environmental stressor creates some kind of bottleneck in society. So an example would be clean drinking water. We had lots of diseases like cholera and dysentery, and we've largely been able to deal with them in the developed world. That wasn't because we developed better medication. Why we got rid of these diseases is because we dealt with the problem upstream. We sanitized water, further upstream. We now need to use that lens when we think about light, because we are in the same position where a shared environmental stressor, in the case of light, is causing a bottleneck in health, where we're spending more and more and more on health, but getting worse and worse and worse outcomes.
Welcome to the Hunger for Change podcast. I'm Niklas Gustafson, and the last decade has been my own long experiment in living more human. What we eat, how we move, and what we surround ourselves with. We're talking about the piece most people miss, rhythm. We're sitting down with Daniel White, a registered nutritionist and a certified health coach, and Jai Kapoor, an AI and tech executive. Together, they've built In Rhythm. Let's break down what In Rhythm actually means in day-to-day life. Daniel and Jai, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us, Niklas. It's been something we've been looking forward to for a while now.
So have I. I'm really looking forward to this. And I'm going to start with my favorite question. One of my favorite questions, because there are many. So what does health mean to you?
Sure. What a question. And I think it really gets down to the core of, to be honest, why many people eventually come across circadian science, circadian rhythms, and longevity in general. I think the term health has come to mean the avoidance of death, right, in Western medicine. And that's the premise that the entire medical system is based on. And there is some validity in that, but for me and for many of us in the space, that's a completely wrong framing, because avoiding death is not the same as promoting life. Okay. And so for me, what health really is those set of circumstances externally and internally that allow you to make the most out of the life that you have, that allow you to to exist in really good states of health that allow you to fulfill all of the dreams and desires that you have, right? Ultimately, it's about the foundational platform that supports your flowering as a human being and the pursuits of your life goals, right? And so for me, it's really about health is really about the living, and that sounds like a strange thing that has to be said, but I think it's an important reframing from what we see when we look at wider industry.
Yeah, I love that. And, in my opinion, it very much overlaps with Jay's. For me, it's about freedom. It's about freedom to express oneself in the way that, our soul, if you like, wishes to in this lifetime. It's about freedom to act and enjoy life both selfishly and selflessly. It's about contribution. It's about interaction with the world in the way in which you want to. And so, I did not have my health when I was a teenager, maybe something we'll speak about soon. And, that really stopped me from doing so many things, going on trips, enjoying nature, being with certain friends in certain environments, contributing to my family and, supporting people that I loved in certain ways, because my focus was so inward on my deficiencies, if you like, and my inabilities as a result of lacking health in many ways. So for me, health has come to mean, freedom, impact, and contribution. But like I said, not totally selflessly. There's a selfish element to be enjoyed in life as well. And so I think it really, it's about, really expressing all of those elements in the healthiest way possible.
Yeah.
And importantly, to add there is the fact that it's a foundational layer of human life, right? An analogy that always comes to mind, and anybody who has been through a health saga or process will identify with this, is you can go about your life thinking you've got 100 problems until you lose your health, and then you have one problem and one problem alone, and that shows you where health is in the sort of the hierarchy of life, let's say, that it really is that most fundamental, foundational pillar that allows the rest of your life and your life ambitions to be based upon.
Daniel, I heard that, I mean, you've been struggling with your health when you were younger. Both of you, could you tell me a little bit more about your background and so that our listeners understand where you come from?
Yeah, sure. We like to tell this in a kind of chronological way because the story kind of neatly twists and spirals and comes together. So for me, I'm age 32 now. From the age of around 13, my health began to seriously deteriorate. I was the first, I believe, of a generation of children who became very deeply fascinated and engaged with the online world, video gaming in particular. When I was 13 years old, there was some not great circumstances within the schooling and education system that I was in. And I chose to, begin to isolate myself and spend time online. And, a hobby of a few hours a day quickly turned into very, very late nights, staring into screens, bright, blue lit, artificial LEDs all night long. And within a period of about 2 or 3 years, my health was decimated. I was ravaged by autoimmune issues, eczema and psoriasis. I was also very overweight, very anxious, very stressed, sleep deprived, and at times actually trying to disengage from technology, like suicidal and very depressed and really, really, really struggling. And so when I was about 17 years old, I think I decided that something really needed to change. And I did what most people do, which is, in a very well-meaning way, began to connect with exercise and, nutrition, but I did it in a very dogmatic and kind of orthorexic way. So, it was how many calories can I burn on the treadmill every day? How many calories can I consume? I'm going to weigh and measure everything I eat because this is what the magazine said, or this is what the doctor told me. And, I was fortunate. I decided to avoid the pharmaceutical kind of route. For some reason, like, just didn't appeal to me. And I thought, it's my responsibility to really fix this. But it was, a really difficult first 5 or 6 years for me because my kind of perspective of life and my sense of self-worth was very intimately tied into, like, was I ticking the box of the correct behavior, to move myself in the direction of health or not? And I had at that time absolutely no awareness of kind of like my spiritual health or really my mental health or so many of these other aspects of a more kind of like functional approach to health. So, my breathing patterns, spending time out in nature, my light exposure, even, intelligent supplementation and things like that were just completely nowhere in my sphere of consciousness at that time. And I laugh a lot because at the time I was studying a degree in psychology. And I say that it taught me a lot about how not to treat people at that time in my life. But fast forward, 5 years from there, I took a master's degree in nutrition. I became very fascinated with functional medicine, started to look at the body and the mind more holistically. And that started to make several improvements to my health and well-being. In fact, I remember waking up one day and sitting in bed and actually like crying tears of joy because I realized that like I wasn't so depressed and I wasn't so controlling of all of my health habits anymore. And I was finding a more natural approach to living.
Where
And
were you living at that time?
Sorry, where was I living at that time?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was in the north of England, up in Leeds, studying my undergraduate degree. And it took a couple more years, really. I began practicing as a nutritionist, and then I found circadian biology. So I kind of felt like I'd found this full circle moment where I realized everything that had been going wrong for me initially in my teenage years, and why my body had become so disrupted, why I had put so much weight on so quickly, why my mental health was really, really struggling. And so developed this passion for photobiology and light as medicine. And that kind of led me on to the various things that I've done in the last sort of half a decade to a decade, from large projects in schools trying to kind of pay that information forward to teenagers, of this generation, kind of philanthropic education programs. We ran something called the Circadian Rhythm Disruption Challenge a few years ago, reached thousands and thousands of people trying to get this basic education out there. And then about this time last year, I was sort of coming out of the process of having run some of those things, and I wasn't really sure where the next steps were. And I guess this is probably a good time to introduce Jay. Maybe Jay will, take the story a little bit further back into his history. But this is around the time that he and I met.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is a little bit different to Dan's. My path to circadian biology is a bit different, but through all the twists and turns, we've ended up in the same place. So I'm very grateful for that. So look, professionally, my background is in AI and in finance, but I guess my health story goes further back than that. And, really, I think I quite early on developed a sense of self-worth that was quite tied up to material achievements, right? Be it academia in school and university, or, the high-flying jobs in the city at the beginning of my career, and then, transitioning over to high-growth AI. I was continuously pushing myself to do more, achieve more, grow more, and wasn't really aware that the impact that this was having on my body. I think I'd become accustomed to living a life just running on adrenaline, right? As many of us do in this modern age. And ultimately, in my last role before we founded In Rhythm, I was the financial exec at a British startup called Wave. We were developing end-to-end AI systems for self-driving, based in London. And during my time there, we scaled from a small company of 20 people to over 400 by the time I left. I understand there's over 1,000 people there now. I was in charge of all things related to finance and fundraising, so led over $1.3 billion worth of capital raising during my time there from investors such as SoftBank, Nvidia, Microsoft. And really that career, was incredible. We reached incredible highs, but I paid the price for it. And around about 2022, beginning of 2022, I developed very sudden but very severe autoimmune psoriasis. So Dan mentioned psoriasis as something that he was also navigating in his life. I had it really, really bad. In fact, most dermatologists that I would go and see would be quite visibly shocked by the photos. We do have the photos. We can send them over in case it's helpful to you or your listeners. But Dan will tell you that it was one of the worst cases of psoriasis that you could have. I was completely covered. I couldn't sleep through the night. I would wake up with blood all over my pillow. I eventually went on all the restrictive diets, gave up gluten, dairy, and eggs, went on the paleo diet, went on the autoimmune protocol, which is like an even more restrictive version of the paleo diet. And, initially went down the Western medicine route, as many of us do, as a first port of call, and was ultimately told, you have an autoimmune disease. Sorry, there's not really much we can do about it. And so I took it upon myself to go down the holistic route and truly tried everything from Ayurveda, Indian medicine, to Chinese medicine, to diet stuff, to nervous system stuff, through osteopathy, craniosacral, meditation, you name it. Truly tried it all. And that was when the universe brought me to Dan, who I met about 18 months ago now. And, we had a very fortuitous conversation in a very random place in London. And, he told me he worked in quantum biology, and I am a science nerd. I'm particularly interested in the intersection of science and spirituality and the quantum realm. And so hearing this term quantum biology sounded kind of like an oxymoron, right? Because what I knew about quantum coherence and, the warm, wet environments of cellular biology, there's a paradox there, right? They're not really the environments that you associate with quantum coherence. So I thought he was making it up. And he told me a little bit more about what he did. He sent me down the rabbit hole of circadian rhythms and circadian biology, where I learned as much as I could. And similar to Dan, sort of had this aha moment where it felt like a lifetime of scientific nerdiness all sort of aligned into a moment where it just made a lot of sense. And so I took myself to a hot country, or a place with more stable light, because it was winter in London at this time. Started living circadianly, and within about 6 weeks, the vast majority of my psoriasis symptoms had disappeared. It took about 6 weeks for 80% of the symptoms to disappear, another 3 months or so for the remaining 20% to disappear. I still live a circadianly aligned life. It is now very much part of life, and I'm, super grateful to be psoriasis-free and free of any other chronic condition like allergic rhinitis that I used to suffer with. That also cleared up. And so I got in touch with Dan. I said, we've got to bring this to the world. And that brings us here.
So this was about 3 years ago when you started to improve.
No, so 3 or 4 years ago is when my symptoms started developing very rapidly. I made these circadian changes December 24 into Jan 25. And so, we're not talking very long ago, right? This time last year, I had been through the healing and was sort of still in the phase of questioning, is this really real? Is this really happening? Is this really possible? So it's really only about a year ago.
About a year ago since you started to improve, so to speak.
Mhm.
Okay, amazing. And now you're feeling well.
Yeah, I feel fantastic. My skin is great. Energy levels are, super consistent. Problems have resolved. So yeah, thriving.
I mean, I'd love to add there that, I worked, as a holistic practitioner for several years with people who had all kinds of autoimmune conditions, right? And I would work with them around the nervous system, and we would work around, as Jay mentioned, autoimmune protocols. And for a very long time, I thought that those were possibly the most important elements of managing autoimmune conditions. And I have never seen anything as drastic an improvement as what Jay experienced. I mean, as he said, we have some photographs. I mean, when Jay showed me these photographs originally, I was shocked at how severe his psoriasis was. It felt to me like there wasn't really an area of his body that wasn't covered in like very, very large, patches. And as somebody who suffered with psoriasis and eczema for most of my life, it would flare up and it would get quite bad. But I was really, really surprised. And it looked like for Jay, and for so many other people that we meet, sometimes the circadian biology piece and this reconnecting with nature is like the missing piece of the puzzle. And so, yeah, it was very, very shocking, but amazing.
So Jay, you mentioned you skipped gluten, you started with the paleo diet and even the autoimmune protocol. Are you still doing the autoimmune protocol? Are you still you're not? And what about the paleo diet? You still follow the paleo? Do you still eat a gluten-free diet?
I have relaxed all of my dietary restrictions and requirements that I was following at that time. Look, I think it's important to note that health is multifaceted, right? There isn't one single thing that's going to be the silver bullet for all health conditions. Even within psoriasis, two different people can have psoriasis for completely different reasons, right? In my case, it seemed that it was a severe circadian rhythm misalignment that was having downstream implications on, the nervous system and ultimately the immune system. Someone else may have psoriasis because they have a violent gluten intolerance, right? It is you will have to experiment and find what it is to you. But what became evident for me was that it was the dietary changes were not making material differences to my health. And it became very clear that it was the circadian alignment. And at that point, I was able to relax those dietary restrictions, and I now live, I eat healthy and I eat consciously, but no
Not
specific
that strict.
restrictions.
All right. So you mentioned Jay, quantum biology. Could you explain what is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, quantum biology is probably best described by, really thinking about the pyramid of science, right? Now, the pyramid of science, at the bottom, you have physics, okay? And because physics is concerned with the very foundational atomic processes that happen in the natural world, right? The smallest and most simple building blocks of nature and reality itself. Above that, you've got chemistry, right? And chemistry is really looking at, a slightly larger lens. You're looking at molecules, you're looking at chemical interactions between different molecules and molecule sets. And this is what starts to define the science of life, right? And at the top of the pyramid, you have biology, which is fundamentally the study of living systems, right? Now, one of the problems we've fallen into within the scientific establishment and medical establishment is that we tend to look at each of these sections quite independently, right? And in particular, within medicine, we really became somewhat obsessed with this paradigm of biochemistry, right? Looking at the body, looking at biology at the top, but really only going one level down and looking at biochemistry, right? And making the assumption that this is the foundational way that health works. Quantum biology, which has emerged over the last couple of decades, is really trying to look at that entire pyramid, but in particular the way in which the science of physics at the subatomic and quantum level can influence biology and therefore life and health. And so we're really looking at biology in the human body as a quantum object. We're asking questions around, the roles and interactions of subatomic particles and how they impact health and physiology. And for me, it's really this sort of much more coherent framework to look at life and health.
Maybe you could just add to that like another phrase that people may be aware of. There's a lot of books that are written about this. The problem is there's a lot of like issues with the nomenclature and the language around these like terms at the minute. A lot of different researchers for many decades have used different terminology. So like biophysics is another way of looking at the impacts of like, physics on biology. And Jay mentioned, looking at these smallest quantum particles, if you like. So we're talking about, just for the listener to understand more broadly, the impacts of like photons from the sun, for example, the impacts of like electrons from the earth and the Schumann resonance, and bringing the body back into coherence through these biophysical actions in the world. So we could also talk about sound, we could talk about even thought, we could talk about vibration, we can talk about frequency and those sorts of things. But as it pertains more to nature, we're looking at like grounding, electromagnetism as well, like natural electromagnetic fields versus non-natural electromagnetic fields and things like that. So it's can sound quite complex, but once you start to like understand that a lot of these areas have been kind of studied in silo, and now we're bringing to like merge them and understand the role that they play together, it makes a little bit more of a coherent story.
Yeah. Both of you mentioned the circadian rhythm several times. If someone has never heard of the circadian rhythm, how would you explain it in a way that it immediately feels like it's relevant to people's daily life?
Look, the circadian rhythm is something that, as a word or a phrase, some people are familiar with. Perhaps you heard it once in school or in university or on a nature program, and then sort of didn't really learn anything more about it. Certainly, that was the perspective that I had. And so, from our time working in the space, I've really tried to distill the answer to the question that you've just said, because we explain these concepts to so many people, and how do we make this as simple and as relevant as possible? And so, at its most fundamental level, the circadian rhythm is the fundamental rhythms of nature, right? That all life on Earth relies on to survive. There are different rhythms that are governed by different cycles and natural dualities, let's call them. For example, the interplay between light and dark is one of the most important, that regulates the circadian rhythms within your body. But at a even more fundamental level, the circadian rhythm gives your body a concept of time. Okay. Now, why that's important is because your body is extremely intelligent. There is a very important natural intelligence that governs all of the processes in your body in a way that modern medicine and modern science really does not understand. Let's be very real about that. We understand a little micro sliver of the infinite number of processes that are required to sustain the body. And amongst all of these processes, there is a degree of coordination that happens, right? All of these processes happen in cycles. The body is not always doing the same thing, okay? And this applies to digestion as well as your sleep-wake cycle, hormonal cycles, and all the other cycles in your body. So what is really important, critically important for the proper functioning of these cycles, is a concept of time, because that is the master level coordinator that governs how all of these processes happen. So an analogy I like to give sometimes is, let's say you take a flight, okay? You take a flight to Japan because you've got some work in Japan and you're going to spend a week in Japan. And your objective is to have a really productive work week. Now, when you land in Japan, the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to set your time, okay, to Japanese time, meaning that you're going to have to bring your perception of time in line with the natural order of time in the place that you are. Now, if you don't do that, you have absolutely no hope of showing up to any meetings or any seminars or anything that you need to do in order to have a productive trip. It's not going to happen. So you need to set that clock. But setting that clock does not immediately guarantee that your meetings are going to be great and you're going to have a productive week. It will ensure that you get to the meetings on time. So it's a necessary condition for optimal performance, but it is not sufficient because, as we said before, health is multifaceted, right? And so why I like this analogy is because it positions circadian rhythms in the overall health hierarchy quite well, in that they're very upstream of many other health interventions that we might hear and talk about in sessions like this. This is really about your body's fundamental infrastructure and your body's fundamental concept of time so that it can regulate and modulate almost every process in your body.
So let's say that someone's been out of sync, health, out of sync with nature. When you want to get back into health through dieting and control, what does usually go wrong psychologically?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to look at. Psychologically, we know that hormonal rhythms, certain neurotransmitters within the brain, for example, are all impacted by our ability to, Jay gave the master example of it, be in rhythm with the correct light exposure on a day-to-day basis. So we can talk about it, from a circadian perspective, which is like the timing element, but there are also like necessary factors that when we connect with certain elements in the environment. So in this case, I'm thinking most immediately about different types of light that are given off by the sun naturally at different times of the day. These control the orchestration of certain processes which can impact, for example, your cognition, your psychological health, and such like that. But it's not only that, as Jay alluded to, things like your digestion, your sleep and your wake time, the quality of your sleep, for example, because of the production and the functioning of certain hormones. All of these things require these necessary conditions where we kind of check in, if you like, with natural cues in our environment at certain times. And, the large issue that we have these days is, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, is that human beings in the last 150 years have gone from living this kind of lifestyle where we were 90% of our time outdoors to now being 90% of our time indoors. And unfortunately, the science is only now just beginning to catch up with the concept of kind of like what we miss indoors versus outdoors. And so, I would say that, and excuse the kind of pun, but we're kind of like largely sleepwalking into this epidemic of circadian rhythm disruption now. And there's so much research, in fact, some of our colleagues and some respected scientists that we work alongside, and they're doing like large population-based research studies, and they're demonstrating that almost every single psychological illness, from anxiety to depression to bipolar to schizophrenia, to ADHD, all of these sorts of things, are intimately interlinked with these disruptions in our circadian rhythms. So, it's a fundamental aspect of almost every area of health, and you can almost bet that there is some level of dysfunction going on a circadian level within every health condition. As Jay alluded to, not only that, it could be our nutrition, it could be our psychological health, it could be our spiritual health, it could be, lack of exercise, it could be many, many things. Toxins, the world is a very toxic place these days. But fundamentally, if our circadian rhythm is not in sync, then it's kind of like all the efforts that we're making in other areas, it's like pushing up a heavy hill, the momentum, if you like, isn't quite there because the body is just not receiving the cues to understand how to simplify the processes that it wants to carry out.
Mm-hmm. And another, just building on what Dan said, Niklas, is sometimes your question was around what are the problems that people run into, for example, when trying to make dietary changes and this kind of thing. And of course, making dietary changes may well cause you, cause great improvements to whatever symptoms you're trying to address. But sometimes the for example, one of the reasons people go down dietary changes is because they want to reduce the amount of inflammation that happens in the body, right? This is the fundamental reason why I make dietary changes. Now, that may bring down inflammation symptoms in your body if you cut out inflammatory foods. But the fundamental truth is that if your body is circadianly misaligned, there is always going to be this low level chronic stress on the system that isn't going to go away, even if you're eating the world's least inflammatory diet, right? Because you haven't actually gone far enough upstream, right? And so this would be, focusing on downstream interventions when we haven't actually fixed the upstream problem. So the downstream interventions may well help a bit, but you're not actually going to get the most out of those changes unless you fixed the upstream problem before you do so.
I would love to just piggyback on what Jay said there, because, talking about nutrition, I got a really good example from when I did a large research project in schools. So I took about 500 children, age 13 to 18, and we equipped them with education and information about reconnecting with nature and realigning their circadian rhythms. And in some groups, we provided some simple tools. Maybe we'll talk about later, things like blue light blocking glasses, for example. And like our principal area of investigation was sleep. Okay, because sleep is probably the most obvious outward manifestation of the circadian rhythm. There's a time at which we fall asleep every day. There's a time at which we wake up. And some people have issues with the timing of that. They want to sleep earlier. They want to sleep later. Poor sleep quality, they sleep well. There's so many different circumstances when it comes to people's sleep. And what we did when we equipped these children with these interventions is we saw a global improvement in sleep across the board. And, I expected them to get to sleep easier. Yep, we saw that. I expected them to wake up maybe with more energy. Yep, we saw that. A little bit less stress and anxiety perhaps before bedtime, by the ability to, wind down as the circadian rhythm would like to. But what I didn't expect so much, because maybe I didn't experience it myself because I'd already spent a lot of time in the nutritional world previously, is that a lot of these children began to say, I'm just not as hungry. I'm not snacking on sugar and carbs, and my diet has just improved effortlessly. And in fact, I want to exercise more, or, these other areas of my health and well-being that seemed so far out of reach, or that, as I said, felt like an uphill battle, suddenly became so much simpler. And when we begin to understand things like melatonin and cortisol rhythms, inflammation and stress in the nervous system, we begin to see that when the body is in rhythm and when we're sleeping better, when we feel safer, and when the metabolism, is able to do what it wants to do in the correct ways, then things like weight loss become more effortless. You might have been eating the same diet for a decade. You get your circadian rhythm in order, and suddenly the diet actually starts to result in the loss of weight, or, the gaining of muscle, or, whatever outcomes it is that you're seeking to resolve. So I think that's always a pleasant surprise for so many people when they make changes to their circadian health, just that like everything else that they were trying so hard to do seems to take a little bit more of a hold.
That's really fascinating, that the circadian rhythm does not only interfere with our sleep, but also with as you said, the diet, even weight loss. I don't think most people know about that, how that works. So if you mentioned several times how important the circadian rhythm is. What do you think are the most common ways that people sabotage their circadian rhythm without realizing it? Accidentally.
Yeah, I would love to speak to this, and then I would love to also flip it, because we developed a really simple and efficient kind of step-by-step protocol, like kind of an acronym that helps us to resolve some of these challenges. I think the things that we see most clearly in modern day are a lack of bright daylight in the morning. In particular, people stay indoors. Perhaps they stare at screens and they receive this signal to wake up. But what we don't understand is our metabolism in particular, especially when it comes to weight, and our brain health and cognition and psychological health, requires very bright daylight in the mornings. You step outside, what we call the light intensity, something we measure in lux, can be something like, 100,000 times brighter outdoors than it is indoors, depending, of course, on
100,000
whether it's a
times.
cloudy day or, yeah. So, bright sunshine, for example, outdoors can be 100,000 lux as a measurement. And we can be indoors in front of a screen and it's only 350 or 400 lux. So we need brighter days and we need darker nights. And the issue with nighttime is that, there's a plethora of technology these days. Unfortunately, more energy efficient light sources, which are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, in your cars, when you're driving home, on the motorways, in the supermarkets, in hospitals, in schools, in homes, everywhere, has adopted this energy efficient, especially in the last decade and a half, particularly cooler white LED lighting. And so I would say the primary issue that we have is this issue with not enough bright daylight during the daytime and too much bright artificial light at night. So we're quite literally flipping, what our body expects in terms of these light and dark cycles. And there are a few other problems as well. You've got to look at the fact that, human beings spent 100% of their time grounded or connected to the earth. We didn't wear shoes. We didn't live in insulated buildings. We didn't have carpets or, roads that disconnected us from what we call the Schumann resonance or the frequency of the earth. So I always say it's a grain of sand on the beach of our evolution that we've lived inside these environments where there's all of these kind of artificial factors. And then the third thing, which I think is another major issue, is the timing of when we eat our meals these days. Our ancestors, they couldn't really, very efficiently hunt and gather and cook and eat very late at night. And so we know from a metabolic standpoint now, from some of the circadian research, that actually we're really designed to digest, metabolize, extract energy, and really carry out these processes within our cells and our mitochondria during the daytime. And so we kind of we drink lots of coffee, we stay hyper-stimulated all day, we work hard indoors, we get to the other end of the day, we're super stressed out, we entertain ourselves with all of this wonderful bright light, eat our dinner late, fall asleep, sleep terribly, struggle to get out of bed to begin the cycle again. And the pattern interrupt for this is really, quite simple and quite profound once you make that realization and then, implement some simple lifestyle changes to kind of correct it.
Yeah. Okay, so there's so many, when it comes to light, there are so many things in today's society that go wrong. But if you could change only one light-related habit, what would you pick?
This is interesting. I think I'll do one and let's see if Jay agrees with me, okay? So back in the day, in fact, I can't give you one because it's two sides of one coin, right? So the first one has to be people's exposure to natural daylight, okay? However, the reality is that we spend 90% plus of our time indoors now. And our indoor environments, the lighting is not fit for purpose, not fit for human biology. And so I fundamentally have come to believe, with a little bit of convincing from Jay over the last 6 months to 12 months, that, telling people to go outdoors is great and it's fundamental and it's very important and it will shift your health and it's one side of this coin, one side. However, a lot of people don't have access to the outdoors for whatever reason. Maybe it's the latitude at which you live. Maybe it's the job that you carry out. Maybe it's, that you're caring for children or the elderly, or, for whatever reason, maybe you just like to be indoors and it's your habit and you're not going to change that anytime soon. And so now I've come to understand, and maybe Jay can pick back on this, that the indoor light environment and actually making shifts to that in terms of creating an environment which is more conducive to human flourishing and support of the circadian rhythm through consideration of the type of light we use indoors. For me, that has now become the number one mission or the lowest hanging fruit that I see helping to create a seismic shift in the future of humanity.
Yeah, I echo everything that Dan says and can build on that. Look, nothing that we do here in Rhythm is a replacement for going outside and connection with nature. It is not possible to build products, services, environments that perfectly replicate nature. And the practice of going outside, reconnecting at the right times of day for as long as you can, that will never be replaced, okay? But as Dan says, we've got to meet people where they are, right? And the fact is people do spend 90% of their time indoors in houses, offices, and other types of environments. So Dan, put very well the importance of addressing the indoor environments. I would take that one step further, and I actually think we need to rethink how we're thinking about indoor lighting, because over the last decades, even a couple of centuries, we've thought about lighting as a consumer product, right? Meaning that it provides the function of illumination, and consumer choice in how that light is used is paramount to its success as a consumer product. the truth is we really need to be thinking about this differently and thinking about it like infrastructure, because it is infrastructure. What do I mean by that? So if you look at the history of civilization, civilization tends to build infrastructure when a shared environmental stressor creates some kind of bottleneck in society, right? So an example would be clean drinking water, right? We had lots of diseases like cholera and dysentery and all these kinds of things, and we've largely been able to deal with them in the developed world. Now, that wasn't because we developed better medication. Of course, the medication helped, but why we got rid of these diseases is because we dealt with the problem upstream. We sanitized water, further upstream. Actually, the consumer was not even involved in that choice, right? You do not have a choice whether the water you drink has been filtered upstream. You may have a choice whether you want to drink it out of a Fiji bottle or out of a tap, but you don't fundamentally have that choice. And the reason you don't have that choice is because there is a biological right and wrong, right? In the case of clean water, it is biologically correct to have water that is free of pathogens, okay? You can't argue really with that. And so that decision is taken away, and that system now operates quietly, continuously in the background, right? And we've got, much better water health than we did before. We now need to use that lens when we think about light, because we are in the same position where a shared environmental stressor, in the case of light, is causing a bottleneck in health, where we're spending more and more and more on health, but getting worse and worse and worse outcomes because we're not really thinking about health and the health hierarchy in the same way. And so, I really want to see a world where we build a new layer of civilizational infrastructure. This is biological infrastructure that allows indoor environments to become coherent with nature for ultimate health and prosperity of the human race.
So when people get aware and they want to make these changes that you are talking about here, what are the first, when they start syncing light exposure with their day, what are the first changes they will notice? How in what way will they notice that this improvement in their health?
Yeah, so I think this is something I can answer, having done a lot of research with thousands of people at this point, and we quite often use very simple questionnaires, scientifically validated, like functional medicine related questionnaires, and they'll look at symptoms across the board from the whole body, right? And things that we most clearly see when people begin to shift their rhythm. The first thing is sleep. Like sleep and energy levels is like categorically always number one. Falling asleep easier, sleeping more deeply, waking up feeling more refreshed, and then having more energy to go about your day the next day. The knock-on impact of that, maybe after a week or 2 weeks, is that the metabolism starts to shift. So we start to maybe perhaps burn fat more easily. We hold on to less fat. Maybe our diet choices become a little bit easier. Maybe, our exercise performance has now shifted. Our cognition is another thing which very quickly shifts. So people can move from states of, hyperactivity or inattention or, lack of clarity to just feeling a lot more grounded, I would say, to feeling a lot more calm, feeling a lot more focused, feeling a lot less agitated. So, there is not a single system of the body that's left unimpacted by this shift in circadian health. The question is just which one is getting the knock-on impact first, and then the domino effect, begins to spread out further and further. You can go as far as things like, recovery from injury, fertility, for example. We know that there's a huge circadian aspect in fertility. Of course, that's not something that's going to become fixed, for example, overnight. And I'm not saying that for any one person, shifting the circadian rhythm is going to fix a health problem. But what we begin to see, I think, if we were to talk, and I don't want to go too deep into the science for the listener, if we think about like the mechanisms within the mitochondria, which are like these, energy centers of the cells where we create and, store structured water and, where we produce basically ATP as a result of all of these different reactions and timings and environmental exposures and nutrition, etc. Well, when those mitochondria function better, there isn't a single area of health that doesn't improve. And, there's a Dr. Doug Wallace, He's in the north of America, and he's done a lot of research to demonstrate that most chronic non-communicable illness is as a result of mitochondrial dysfunction. You have cardiovascular disease. Yeah, you have dysfunction of the mitochondria within your heart. You have, a psychological issue. I'm not saying it's always mitochondrial and it's the only element and aspect, because obviously there's a lot of trauma and, psycho-spiritual aspects to consider in some of these issues. But you better bet that, the mitochondria within your brain, they're not functioning as well. So, the question is what area doesn't get impacted in some essence. But most largely it's just being able to get to sleep and waking up feeling like you have more energy for life, which is the first step you need on the long journey of improving your health, right? Without energy, it's a lot more difficult to get anything done.
Okay, so Daniel, you mentioned a couple of times already the job that you've been doing on children. Let's go back to that for a moment. I'd like to know what you think schools get wrong about the learning environment. What are the major things that the schools normally don't do the way they should?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, I use the analogy all the time. Like we've sleepwalked into this situation now where we spend so much time indoors. Right? When I was a child, which wasn't that long ago, right? I was at school maybe a decade and a half ago. I remember that we had entire lessons outside. We would go outside to do our maths lesson. We go outside to do our drama lesson. We do our physical activity outdoors. I mean, obviously not if it was bucketing down with rain, and that can be an issue. Darkness and poor weather conditions can be an issue, especially in the northern hemisphere in the winter and things like that. But now we live indoors, and the problem with schools is, in my opinion, and it's not like to bash schools, but budgets are very tight, right? Especially in public schools. And so when you build schools and when you build buildings, things like lighting and things like windows, those are like the last things that you consider. They are the bottom of the pile when it comes to the budget, right? They want to spend the budget on activities and learning and training for staff and like all of these wonderful, amazing things that are to enrich children. But we already know, and we've known this for like 3 or 4 decades now, thanks to the work of Dr. John Ott, who was such a pioneer in the area of light and health. And that, when you put children for long periods of time under these LED lights, under these fluorescent lights and in front of screens, their nervous systems become highly agitated. They cannot focus, they cannot concentrate, they misbehave. Rates of ADHD, inattention, hyperactivity, all of those things, come through the roof. Whereas, and I'm sure you can remember when perhaps you were a child, spending time in the classroom, spending time outdoors, and all of these sorts of things are fantastic. And I think that, there are shifts that can be made to more intelligently designed buildings with more natural light. I give you one really good example is, there was an initiative, I think it began in Scotland, and it was called the Daily Mile. Okay, so this came from the perspective of wanting children to exercise more. And what they did was, at the first class of every day, they would take children outdoors to walk a mile or run a mile around the school campus. Thousands of schools all across the UK did this, right? But the inadvertent effect of this is that they were setting their circadian rhythm every morning by getting the right light exposure. Now, I don't know if that's happening everywhere, but the side, the other side of the coin from that is child wakes up tired, child gets in car, child gets to school, child sits under bright lights all day. And this is the biggest issue, and it's partly a school's issue and partly a home, and parenting and child behavioral decision issue.
Mm-hmm. And I think the problem is actually getting compounded, right? Because what Dan alluded to is, structural problems with the actual learning environment and, too much time being spent indoors. The other problem is that children's lives are getting much more tech-centric than ours were when we were younger, right? I remember the times in primary school where we had a chalkboard, right, for notes. Then eventually that turned into an interactive whiteboard. Suddenly you had a large screen, a live screen there, right? And that was what was happening when I was in school. But at the very least, we weren't always centered around technology. Now, when I speak to, children of friends or nieces, nephews, that kind of thing, they require a smartphone or a tablet to even do their homework and to even keep track of their homework. And there's not even, we used to use homework diaries, right? Actual bits of paper where you would write what you need to do for homework. And all of these things are becoming extremely tech-centric. So it actually compounds this problem because we're getting even less time outdoors and even more time that children are spending in front of devices, which they're also spending time on in their recreational time, right? And so it really, it's, it's a serious problem for younger generations. We're increasingly seeing social media outlawed for under 16s, in different countries across the world, which I think is starting to deal with this problem. But this is a pretty severe problem.
And I think if I was to put my finger on like one aspect, like to highlight everything that Jay said in particular, is the nighttime light exposure. When I was a child, as I said, I was the first of a generation who made a decision to be there like, no, mum, I'm not coming off my computer. You go to bed, I'm staying up, right? I didn't have a smartphone. I didn't have a laptop. I had a dial-up, modem computer, a Dell, an old school thing. And I made that happen for myself. Now it's so easy and so simple for children to be exposed to artificial light, the wrong type of artificial light, this cool, super high blue wavelength light at night that just dysregulates their entire biology. And unfortunately, children are hypersensitive to it because the iris of the eye does not develop fully until the early 20s. So actually, they absorb a lot more of this short wavelength light. And there are things that can be done about it. I mean, an example is, in the school's research, we gave them all, and I don't know if anybody's watching right now as opposed to listening, we gave them all nighttime blue light blocking glasses. So, this is an imperfect solution to the problem, but this is one example of how drastically, a child's health can shift if you're ensuring that they're not getting exposure into the eye with the wrong type of light at night.
I love what you say about Daniel. What you say when you were at school, you spent more time outdoors. You even had classes outdoors. That makes me remember when I was a kid. I'm so much older than you are. I was, my childhood was in Sweden. That was during the 70s, the 80s. I'm 56 years old now, and I remember how the best part of the day was when we could go outdoors. In Sweden at that time, I don't know if it's still like that, but you were outdoors all year round, even if we had like 15 degrees Celsius below zero, or if it was like hot, we were always outdoors. And we were taught that there were no bad weather. Weather didn't exist. The only thing that existed was bad clothes.
Yes, I love that.
So I do really hope that we will get back to where being outdoors was the best part of the day. But it's also hard with the screens because there is so much exciting things going on the screens. And that leads me to the next question. Jay, you've been in the tech business, and you see the evolution with the artificial intelligence, how important it is to not miss that train. We need to be there. We need to embrace the new technologies. What do you think AI will do for education if we do it right?
Gosh, I mean, it's a big topic. Look, AI is going to fundamentally change many things about the world. It already has, right? The ease of access to not just information, but actual, reasoning has already worked wonders for many different industries in the world. And we're still at the early stages of this transition, right? There's a lot of hype in financial markets right now about whether AI is overvalued and whether it's, we've done too much too soon. But those commentaries are more about time scale rather than the ultimate inevitability of AI, which I think we can all agree is inevitable and is going to become a valuable tool in society. Now, a tool is only as valuable as the intention and the way in which that tool is used, right? This is the same with any tool. And so a tool can be detrimental to a society. It can be detrimental to the development of an adolescent's brain, or it can be, it can be helpful and it can be ameliorative to all these things. And so I think, we'd be remiss to be trying to remove AI from people's lives. That's just not a realistic thing that's going to happen. But I think what's important is to not just focus on the AI of artificial intelligence, but actually focus also on what we call natural intelligence, right? Now, what's the difference between these two things? Artificial intelligence is a human designed, created intelligence that focuses on some external goal. Okay, so some optimization problem or something like that, right? AI is very good at handling situations like that, but fundamentally it is a designed intelligence with some external objective that it's focused on. Natural intelligence, by contrast, is that intelligence which emerges from the interplay of life and nature itself, right? So the human brain, right, can be described as a version of a quantum computer with, or, different ways of looking at it. But ultimately, it's a form of emergent intelligence from the interplay of life. And why that's important? Because there is an inherent intelligence within nature that is giving us the foundation to live in optimal health, even in light of these other tools that we now have to make use of, right? And an example of where this natural intelligence is inherent in nature is, for example, in the cycle of natural daylight as it moves through the day. Daylight changes through the day, and those changes give your body and brain signals that the intelligence of your body interprets and builds its processes upon. So the most important thing is that we need to be able to use tools like artificial intelligence whilst also ensuring that we are living in accordance with the natural intelligence of nature and the earth, because that is what's going to give us the foundation to be able to use AI as a tool for productivity that does not end up, dominating our health and our headspace in the way that may happen if its usage is completely, unrestricted, both at the regulatory level, but also at the personal level, right? If we don't have this awareness that, I've been in front of ChatGPT for 2 or 3 hours, I should go outside, take a break from the computer, get some natural light in my eyes, and actually counterbalance the potential negative consequences of this very valuable and very amazing tool. But it needs to be balanced by a reconnection to the natural intelligence of nature.
I think I would also just add there. I think as data sets become larger, understanding like the circadian biology, like influence on, for example, education, on learning, on children's health, which is already happening now. We have a great opportunity here to build like buildings and lighting and infrastructure and like schedules and classrooms and tasks intelligently so that, AI can facilitate this more symbiotic relationship with nature again. It can help us to understand that, okay, what I'm trying to teach here is going to be better learned if I have prompted this child to take that daily mile or to spend that time outdoors at lunchtime or to reconnect with nature. And we may even begin to see from data sets in the future, like, oh, okay, learning is improved, the efficiency of learning is improved outdoors. So certain activities should be done in that way, right? Because you cannot hide from these big data sets in the long term. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity, and maybe not one that many people are leveraging right now.
Could you please tell me about this bulb? What makes this sleep bulb different from warm lid that people already use?
Yeah, sure. So I'll speak to it for a moment. So the Better Sleep Bulb is an example of the first products that in Rhythm, our organization, has brought to the market. And so what we wanted to do in creating this bulb was to design something that would embed like the principles of kind of natural shifts in the light spectrum to ensure that people were not overstimulated, and actually more so that the nervous system and the circadian system is able to relax efficiently and keep a record of time correctly in kind of symbiosis with nature. So we developed a bulb that has 3 settings. Now it's very simple, it's analog, and how you shift between these settings, you turn the light switch, just your normal light switch, turn it on and off quickly, and it will move from a warm white setting, which is very clear. You can see everything that you need to do, but it doesn't provide enough of the wavelengths of light that would cause you stimulation or perhaps stress that a modern light bulb does. And then you shift into an evening setting, which reduces the blue light content, which is the same thing that's happening out in nature. Anyone who's watched a beautiful golden sunset, for example, will know that the blue sky begins to turn into a warmer kind of gold and amber, and maybe even perhaps reddy sky. And then our third setting is, designed to, as closely as possible with current LED technology, mimic firelight. So a very deep, warm red. And we also designed the bulb so that it moves from a brighter setting, the day setting, and it gets progressively dimmer and dimmer. So the intensity or the lux also decreases as you cycle through into the evening. There's some other pretty kind of world first features of the bulb as well. We integrated enhanced and enriched infrared technology. So all natural light sources, particularly sunlight and firelight, have a very broad spectrum of what we call infrared light. It's a type of light that we can't see with the eye, but that has very important biological and biophysical impacts on the body and on our cells. And it's a type of light which, causes a kind of a balance or an equilibrium when kind of combined with what we call shorter or the bluer wavelengths. So your listeners might have heard of this idea that blue light is, the boogeyman, and we need to avoid blue light at all costs. And that's not true. The reality is we need to intelligently time our exposure to this type of light. Lots of bright light from the sun during the day, but in the afternoon, evening, and the nighttime, we want that amount of blue light to lower. So we developed this bulb to basically be the healthiest bulb out there for sleep, hence the better sleep bulb. Another cool function of it is that it's designed so the LED driver has no flicker effect. So another problem that we have in modern lighting is that the lighting flickers perhaps 50 or 60 times or hertz per second, which can cause lots of neurological problems. So we really wanted to put out into the market, a first product that we could demonstrate to people that lighting can be done so much better. It can be done far more in accordance with nature and in a way in which it can allow our body to not only keep a record of time correctly, but actually receive biological benefit from the light itself. Not as much as from fire and not as much as from sunlight. Obviously, we didn't get a great opportunity to dive into the biological benefits of those light sources today, but we designed a light source which is not only neutral, but is actually health enhancing. And so that's something that we have out at the moment. And we're looking, in the future at developing other types of lighting and very exciting stuff that we hope to research and, generate big data sets around so that we can inform, the development of infrastructure, globally moving forward so that we can develop this biological right and wrong. And so that we can bring our environments in the truest sense in rhythm.
And when you mentioned the flicker, so there's no flicker at all. How is that possible? Because all these electronic based light bulbs or screens, they all have flickers. How did you solve that?
Yeah, it's about how you deliver power to the driver and how it pulsates the LED chips. So we're very lucky that we worked with a very skilled research and development team and manufacturer who were actually, willing to put more time and effort into research and development around like drivers which didn't need to flicker. It's basically a design decision, and cheaper, like quicker to develop drivers have this flicker effect. So, flicker it doesn't really happen in the natural world, right? You look at a fire and you can see the fire flickering, right? But with these cheaper, forms of lighting, which obviously it's just been kind of like a race to the bottom, right? For the last decade, it's like, how much cheaper and more energy efficient and, how much more quickly can we design and pump out all of these kind of LEDs and make more money. And, there's obviously entire manufacturing industries across all sorts of countries around the world that are trying to race to develop things as quickly and as cheaply as possible. But with a little bit of, intelligent design and kind of stepping back, you can do things differently. And so it's, it's a very exciting time. And I mean, personally, I've got one of the bulbs up here above my head now. It's providing like light to me for this podcast. I mean, it's just so relaxing to be around. You get to the end of the day, your eyes don't hurt, your head's not, janky, and you don't feel so exhausted after being under an artificial light like you might otherwise.
So you mentioned classrooms, you mentioned our homes. Where do you see this going long term? I mean, what does a circadian home or circadian classroom standard look like?
Yeah, I'll let Jay answer this one, I think.
Yeah, look, I think you used the right word, right? The word is standard, because in order to actually realize this vision of, a new layer of civilizational infrastructure, we need a defined standard which outlines what, this concept of biological right and wrong is. How should your light environment change through the day? What are the important parameters to look for? I want to make it clear that we need to be humble about this as well, because the whole field is developing very, very quickly, and we will learn more things, right, as time goes on. And so it's very important that when we build these standards and protocols, which is something that we are doing internally, it's important to bring a lot of humility to this process and really make this a global coordinated effort and get the best minds in the world around this, because ultimately we're doing this for the ultimate health and prosperity of humankind. And so a protocol needs to define exactly how the light needs to behave. It may also need to optimize for different environments and use cases. For example, the way that your light behaves in an office environment can be different to how it is at home, because you're not optimizing, for late night sleep, let's say. And so ultimately people do require, a protocol and a standard, but also simple and easy tools to actually get there, right? And that's what we've been designing with the Better Sleep Bulb. We've chosen those settings based on a ton of research in terms of the impacts on human physiology. That research will continue, and we, those bulbs are fundamentally tunable. And so we will, what we're really driving at is giving the world a frame of reference, a reference point to orient around, which would suggest that, this is how lighting is supposed to develop. And we're going to build the world's largest circadian data set of physiological changes based on this framework, and then use our product and service set to basically effortlessly enable customers and businesses to be in line with the protocol, and therefore bring all of their environments into coherence at scale.
Amazing. So where can people find this bulb, and where can people find you?
Sure. So our website is the best place to go for all of this. It's inrhythm.earth is the URL. We have an education program on there, which is a bit of a do-it-yourself thing. It's called Life in Rhythm. We run that with a good couple of hundred people now. It's been fantastic. It's kind of like an amalgamation of 10 years of my education and research, and making things super simple and practical for people. So the educational element, in my opinion, and Jay's and for as well, is still very, very important. But we also have the Better Sleep Bulb on the website. So inrhythm.earth, I believe the forward lean is the Better Sleep Bulb. We're also on Instagram, so inrhythm.earth on Instagram, and we've got our own personal Instagrams and things like that. Perhaps we can drop in the show notes so people can come and find us.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting. It's been very exciting to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niklas.
Thanks very much, Niklas.
This was just one episode. There's so much more to discover. Check out the full podcast series, subscribe for future episodes, and let me know your thoughts in the comments.